The caseworker sat at our kitchen table with a clipboard, asking if I was capable of choosing my own friends. I looked at Ryan on the porch, tattoos covered by a collared shirt he never wears, and thought about the day he waved at me on a bench outside a diner back when I had no one. Someone had reported him, said a man like him had no business around a girl like me. They didn't know he'd shown up every Tuesday since, rain or cold, never once late. What they were about to find out was that 4 more motorcycles were already pulling up outside, and none of them were leaving until someone listened to what I had to say. Grace Callahan counted the cracks in the sidewalk on her way to the bus stop every morning, the same way she had since she was small, 14 cracks between her front porch and the corner of Elm and Birch. She liked things that stayed the same. 20 years old now, she still lived with her mother, Diane, in the small blue house on Birch Street in East Nashville, the one with the wind chimes that never quite matched each other because Diane kept buying new ones at the flea market instead of finding the sets that belonged. Grace worked 3 mornings a week, sorting donations at the Sunnyside Community Thrift Store, folding sweaters into neat squares and lining up shoes by size. She liked the work. She liked Sarah Bennett, who ran the front register and always saved her the peppermint candies from the jar by the till. What Grace did not like, what she had stopped mentioning to her mother because it made Diane's face go tight and worried, was how quiet her life had become outside of those 3 mornings. She used to have a friend. Her name was Kayla, and they had gone to the same special education transition program until Kayla's family moved to Ohio 2 years ago. Since then, there had been nobody. Grace was polite to the people at the store, and Sarah was kind to her, but kind was not the same as a friend who called just to talk, who wanted to know how your day had gone because they cared and not because it was their job to ask. On a grey Tuesday in October, Grace sat on the bench outside the thrift store waiting for her mother to pick her up, as she did most days. The wind had picked up, carrying the smell of rain that hadn't started yet. Grace pulled her jacket tighter and watched the traffic on Gallatin Pike. That was when she heard the motorcycles. 3 of them came around the corner in formation, engines low and rolling, and pulled into the gravel lot beside Duke's Diner next door. The men who climbed off wore leather vests with patches sewn across the back, an eagle and a set of crossed wrenches beneath the words Iron Wolves MC. Grace had seen bikers before. Her mother always tensed a little when they passed on the highway, gripping the wheel tighter, though she never explained why. One of the men noticed Grace watching. He was tall, with a greying beard and forearms marked with faded tattoos, and instead of looking away or laughing the way some people did when they caught Grace staring too long, he lifted 2 fingers off the handlebar in a small wave. Grace waved back before she could stop herself. The man's name, though Grace would not learn it until the following week, was Ryan Whitfield. He was 34 years old, and he had been riding with the Iron Wolves for 6 years, ever since he came back from 2 deployments and could not stand the sound of his own house being quiet. The club was not what people assumed. There was no crime, no violence beyond the occasional bar argument that Marcus Reeves, the club's president, broke up before it started. Mostly they rode and raised money for veterans' families, but nobody in Nashville seemed to care about that part. They cared about the vests and the noise, and made their assumptions accordingly. Ryan had grown used to the way people crossed the street when they saw him coming. He had stopped being angry about it years ago. It was easier to expect nothing than to keep being disappointed. He noticed the girl on the bench because she did not do any of that. She did not look away in fear, and she did not stare with the particular kind of pity he'd learned to recognize and despise. She just watched, openly curious. The following Tuesday, Ryan came back to Duke's Diner alone, on foot this time, needing coffee before a long shift at the garage where he worked as a mechanic. Grace was on the bench again. She looked up at him and said, without any preamble, "You waved at me last week." "I did," Ryan said, surprised into a small laugh. "You've got a good memory." I remember things I like, Grace said. I like that you waved. Most people don't. Ryan sat down on the far end of the bench, not too close. The way he'd learned to give people space until they showed him they wanted less of it. Why's that? People too busy? Grace considered the question seriously, the way she considered most questions. I think they're scared of me, or they feel sorry for me. Both feel bad. She looked over at him. You didn't do either one. No reason to, Ryan said. You seem all right to me. They talked for 20 minutes before Diane's car pulled up. Grace told him about the thrift store, about the peppermints, about the way she liked to organize the donated books by color instead of by title because it looked nicer on the shelf, even if Sarah always put them back the other way. Ryan told her when she asked that he fixed motorcycles and sometimes cars, and that the patch on his vest meant he rode with a club of friends who looked out for each other. Do you have a lot of friends? Grace asked. The question landed harder than Ryan expected. A few, he said. Good ones. I used to have a friend, Grace said. Her name was Kayla. She moved away. She said it simply, without drama, the way she said most things, but Ryan heard the weight underneath it anyway. I just wanted a friend, she added, so quietly he almost missed it. And then Diane's car pulled up and Grace stood, said goodbye with a small wave that mirrored the one he'd given her the week before, and got in the car. Ryan stood on the sidewalk for a long moment after she left, turning the words over. I just wanted a friend. He thought about all the people who had made assumptions about him before ever speaking to him, and he thought about how easily this girl had done the opposite, had simply seen a man on a bench and decided he was worth talking to. He did not know yet how much that Tuesday would come to matter. He only knew that when he rode home that evening, he found himself thinking about a friendship that had ended too soon, and a young woman on a bench who deserved better than a world that only knew how to look away or stare. Diane Callahan noticed the change in her daughter before she understood the cause of it. Grace had always been an open book, narrating her day in careful, unhurried detail on the drive home from the thrift store. But that first Tuesday, she had a new thread running through her account of folded sweaters and peppermint candies. A man named Ryan, who rode a motorcycle and had waved at her. Diane's stomach tightened at the word motorcycle and tightened further at the word man, though she said nothing at first, not wanting to dampen the light in her daughter's voice. Grace so rarely talked about people outside the house with this kind of energy, but by the third week, when Grace mentioned that Ryan had shown her a picture of his sister's dog on his phone, and the fourth week, when she said he'd brought her a peppermint of his own because he'd noticed she liked them, Diane decided it was time to see for herself. She parked a block early the following Tuesday and walked the rest of the way, arriving at the bench outside Duke's Diner, just as Ryan was crouched down, showing Grace something on his phone screen, while Grace laughed, a full, unguarded laugh that Diane had not heard in longer than she wanted to admit. Ryan stood when he saw her coming, and Diane watched him do it, watched the careful way he held himself, hands visible, no sudden movements, like a man who had learned exactly how his size and his ink and his leather made people feel and had decided to work around it rather than resent it. You must be Grace's mum, he said. Ryan Whitfield. I hope it's all right that I've been talking with her. She's easy to talk to. Diane studied him for a long moment. Up close, the tattoos were less alarming than they'd seemed from a distance, mostly military insignia, and a few dates that she suspected marked things she shouldn't ask about. His eyes were tired, in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. How old are you? Diane asked, aware it was a strange question but needing some anchor. 34, ma'am. And you spend your Tuesday mornings on a bench talking to my daughter? I do. He didn't flinch from the implication in her tone, didn't get defensive the way Diane had half expected. I know how that sounds. I promise you it's not anything but what it looks like. She's good company, better than most people I know, honestly. He paused, You're welcome to stay and listen to every word if it make you feel better. I've got nothing to hide." Diane did stay, that day and the next, sitting a short distance away with a magazine she didn't read, watching her daughter talk with an animation she hadn't seen since Kayla moved away. Ryan never once talked down to Grace, never used the falsely bright sing-song voice Diane had heard from well-meaning strangers over the years. He asked her real questions and waited for real answers. He disagreed with her sometimes, gently, about which was better, chocolate or peppermint, and Grace argued back with the kind of stubborn delight that told Diane this felt, to her daughter, exactly like a real friendship. Because it was one. By November, Ryan had started bringing his motorcycle by on the days he could get away from the garage, and he would let Grace sit on it while it was parked, teaching her the names of the parts, the throttle and the clutch and the chrome pipes that she liked to trace with one finger because she said they were shiny like the ocean. Not everyone approved. Kevin Sanders, who lived 2 doors down from the Callahans and had never had a kind word for anyone on Birch Street, cornered Diane at the mailbox one afternoon in mid-November. "I've seen that biker hanging around your girl," he said, not bothering with a greeting. "You ought to be careful. Men like that, they don't just show up for nothing." "Men like what, Kevin?" Diane asked, keeping her voice even though her jaw had tightened. "You know what I mean. Look at him, that whole gang of his." Kevin shook his head, and her, with her condition. She doesn't always know when someone's taking advantage. Diane felt something sharp rise in her chest, but she held it. "Ryan has been kinder to my daughter than almost anyone in this neighborhood," she said. "Including you, if we're being honest. He shows up, he listens to her. He's never once made her feel like a burden or a project. That's more than I can say for most people who claim to be worried about her." Kevin muttered something about how she'd regret it and walked off, but the encounter left Diane rattled in a way she didn't fully understand until she brought it up with Ryan the following Tuesday. Ryan's jaw tightened when she told him, but he didn't explode the way she half feared. Instead, he went quiet for a moment, watching Grace, who was across the lot admiring another rider's motorcycle with Sarah Bennett, who had come out on her break. "I've heard that kind before," Ryan said finally. "My whole life, people have decided what I am based on the vest. Doesn't matter what I actually do. Doesn't matter that half my club spends their weekends raising money for kids whose dads didn't come home from deployment or fixing up cars for single mums who can't afford a mechanic. People see the leather and the bike, and they've already written the story." He looked at Diane. "I'm not going to pretend that doesn't sting, but I'm not going anywhere because of it either. Grace deserves a friend who shows up, and I intend to keep showing up unless you tell me not to." Diane studied him. This man her neighbors feared on sight, who had just described her daughter's worth more clearly than anyone had in years. "I'm not telling you that," she said. "I just needed to hear it from you directly." "You'll hear it as many times as you need to," Ryan said. That evening, Grace came home and, unprompted, told her mother that Ryan had introduced her to Marcus Reeves, the club president, a broad-shouldered man with a booming laugh who had shaken Grace's hand like she was someone important and asked her opinion on which of the club's motorcycles was the best looking. Grace had picked the blue one decisively, and Marcus had agreed with her so enthusiastically that she'd laughed until she had to sit down. "They're my friends now," Grace told her mother that night, brushing her teeth, toothpaste smeared at the corner of her mouth the way it always was. "All of them. Ryan and Marcus and the other ones, whose names I'm still learning." Diane kissed the top of her daughter's head and did not tell her about Kevin Sanders or about the tight protective fear that still lived somewhere beneath her relief. She only said, "I'm glad, baby. I'm really glad." But the fear had a source, and it would resurface soon enough, in a way none of them could have anticipated. The trouble started in December, 3 days after the Iron Wolves' annual holiday charity run, an event Grace had been allowed to attend for the first time, riding in Marcus Reeves's truck behind the pack of motorcycles instead of on a bike herself, since Ryan and Diane had agreed that was safest. Grace had spent the whole day glowing, handing out toy donations to families at the community center, wearing a small leather vest Marcus had commissioned for her with a patch that read, "Honorary Wolf," stitched beneath the club's eagle. She wore the vest to the thrift store on Monday, proud of it in a way that made Sarah Bennett tear up a little behind the register, but not everyone at Sunnyside shared Sarah's warmth. The store's new assistant manager, a woman named Patricia Fields, who had only been on staff for a month, pulled Sarah aside that afternoon. "That vest isn't appropriate for the sales floor," Patricia said. "It's not exactly the image we want for the store, and frankly I don't think it's a good idea, her spending so much time with those motorcycle people. Have you seen the news stories about clubs like that? I did some reading. It's concerning." Sarah, who had worked at Sunnyside for 6 years and had never once heard a complaint about Grace, felt her temper flare. "Grace has been coming here since before you started, Patricia. The Iron Wolves have done nothing but good by her. I'd be careful making assumptions about people you've never met." But Patricia was not so easily deterred. 2 days later she called Diane at work, her voice clipped and falsely concerned, suggesting that perhaps it would be best if Grace's hours were reduced, that the store had received some concerns from customers about a biker gang member regularly picking Grace up after her shifts, that it might not reflect well on the store's image. Diane, standing in the hospital break room with her lunch untouched, felt fury rise in a way she rarely allowed herself. "Ryan Whitfield has never once caused trouble at your store," she said. "He waits outside. He's polite to every person who walks past him. The only thing he's guilty of is being kind to my daughter. And if that's a problem for Sunnyside, then I have a much bigger problem with your store than you apparently have with him." Patricia backed off the subject of hours, but the damage had already reached Grace, who overheard part of the conversation through the store's thin office wall and came home that evening unusually quiet, the kind of quiet Diane had learned to worry about. "Patricia doesn't like Ryan," Grace said finally, sitting at the kitchen table, pushing a piece of chicken around her plate without eating it. "She thinks he's dangerous. She thinks I don't understand things good enough to know who my friends are." Diane's heart broke a little at the flatness in her daughter's voice. The resignation of someone who had heard this particular judgment about herself many times before, in many different forms, from many different people. "You understand plenty, baby. You understand more about people than most folks I know." "Then why does she get to decide?" Grace asked, and for a moment her voice cracked, the composure she usually carried through these situations slipping. "Why does everybody get to decide things about me without asking me first?" Diane didn't have a good answer because there wasn't one. She only pulled her daughter into a hug and let her cry it out at the kitchen table, feeling her own anger settle into something colder and more determined. The following Tuesday, Ryan noticed immediately that something was wrong. Grace sat on the bench with her shoulders drawn in, none of her usual eagerness to show him something new she'd noticed, or ask him a question she'd been saving up all week. When he asked what was wrong, she told him everything, haltingly, about Patricia and the vest and the phone call to her mother. Ryan felt the old, familiar heat rise in his chest, the same heat he used to feel overseas when he watched people underestimated and dismissed because of a uniform or a label instead of who they actually were. He had learned, slowly and at some cost, how to sit with that anger instead of acting on it recklessly. But this was different. This wasn't about him being misjudged. This was about Grace being denied the one thing she had asked for from the very beginning, simply being seen as capable of choosing her own friends. "I'm sorry," Ryan said. "That's not fair, and it's not right. And I want you to know none of it is because of anything you did." "I know," Grace said, though her voice wobbled, "but it still doesn't feel good, and I don't know how to make her stop." Ryan sat with that for a long moment, watching the traffic slide by on Gallatin Pike the way it had the very first day he'd noticed her. He thought about every assumption ever made about him, every time someone had decided who he was before he'd said a single word, and he thought about how much worse it must feel to have people question not just your character, but your ability to know your own mind. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "the people who don't know you get to have opinions about you for a while. That's not fair, but it's true. What matters is that the people who do know you, the ones who've actually spent time with you, don't let those opinions win." He looked at her. "Your mom didn't let Patricia win. I'm not going to let her win either. And I don't think you should let her make you doubt yourself, because there is not one thing wrong with the way you choose your friends. You chose right the first time you waved back at me." Grace managed a small, watery smile at that. "I did wave back. Best decision anybody's made about me in years," Ryan said. And it wasn't a joke, not really. And Grace seemed to understand that, because she reached over and squeezed his hand, the way she'd learned to do with people she trusted completely. But the conversation with Patricia had planted something uglier that would not stay contained to the thrift store. Within a week, Kevin Sanders had heard a version of the story secondhand, embellished in the retelling, and he brought it to the Birch Street Neighborhood Association meeting that Thursday, suggesting that certain outside influences around the Callahan residence warranted some kind of formal complaint, perhaps even a call to social services to check on Grace's living situation and, more specifically, on who had access to her. Diane found out about the meeting only after the fact, from a sympathetic neighbor who thought she should know, and the news landed like a stone in her stomach. A call to social services, questioning her fitness as a mother, questioning Grace's independence, all because a man had shown her daughter more consistent kindness than anyone else in the neighborhood ever had. It was the deepest fear Diane carried, quietly every day of Grace's adult life, that someone, somewhere, would decide Grace needed to be protected from her own choices, that her daughter's autonomy could be stripped away by people who had never bothered to actually know her. That fear would come to a head faster than Diane expected, and it would take every ounce of courage in the people who loved Grace most to meet it. The knock came on a Wednesday evening in mid-December, while Grace was in the kitchen, helping her mother wrap a batch of sugar cookies for the Iron Wolves' upcoming toy drive. Diane opened the door to find a woman in a grey coat, holding a clipboard, introducing herself as a caseworker, following up on a concern that had been reported regarding Grace's living situation and personal associations. Diane's blood went cold, but she kept her voice level as she invited the woman in, sitting her at the kitchen table while Grace, sensing the tension, grew quiet and watchful in the doorway, the tray of half-decorated cookies still balanced in her hands. "Grace, honey, could you set those down and come sit with us?" Diane asked, working hard to keep her voice steady. Grace set the tray on the counter carefully, lining the cookies up the way she always did, and came to sit at the table, her eyes moving between her mother's tense face and the stranger with the clipboard, the caseworker, a tired-looking woman named Ms. Ortiz, who Diane could tell did not particularly want to be there either, explained that an anonymous complaint had alleged that Grace was being exposed to an unsafe and potentially exploitative environment involving a motorcycle club, and that the complaint had questioned whether Grace, given her disability, was capable of consenting to the relationship she'd formed. "I need to ask you some questions, and I'd like to speak with Grace directly, if that's all right," Ms. Ortiz said. "It's standard procedure. I'm not here to accuse anyone of anything. I just need to document that everything is as it should be." Diane's hands trembled as she nodded, and Grace, brave in a way that surprised even her mother, walked over and sat down at the table across from Ms. Ortiz without being asked. "You can talk to me," Grace said. "I can answer for myself." Ms. Ortiz asked her gentle, careful questions about her job, about her friendships, about whether she felt safe at home, whether anyone had ever pressured her or made her uncomfortable. Grace answered each one clearly, describing Ryan not as a stranger who had appeared from nowhere, but as a friend who had waved at her on a bench 2 months ago and had shown up every week since, who had introduced her to people who treated her like she mattered, who had never once asked her for anything or made her feel like less than a whole person. "He's my friend," Grace said simply near the end. "I picked him. Nobody made me. I wanted a friend, and he wanted to be one. That's all it is." Ms. Ortiz wrote for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then asked if she could meet this Ryan Whitfield in person, as part of documenting the household's associations. Diane called him that night, her voice shaking as she explained what had happened. Ryan was quiet on the other end of the line for a moment before he spoke. "I'll be there whenever they need me," he said. "Whatever paperwork, whatever questions, I've got nothing to hide, and I want them to see that clearly." The meeting was set for the following Monday at the Callahan house, with Ms. Ortiz present along with a colleague. Ryan arrived early in a collared shirt instead of his cut, though he kept the vest folded over his arm because, he told Diane quietly on the porch, he wasn't going to pretend to be someone he wasn't just to look more acceptable. If they were going to judge him, they could judge the whole truth. What none of them expected was that Marcus Reeves would arrive as well, along with 3 other members of the Iron Wolves, all in their club vests, parking their motorcycles neatly along the curb and walking up to the house with a folder of documents in hand. "Figured you might need some backup," Marcus said to Ryan on the porch, before turning to Ms. Ortiz, who had come to the door at the sound of the engines with visible apprehension. "Ma'am, I'm Marcus Reeves, president of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club. I understand there's a concern about our involvement with Grace Callahan, and I'd like the chance to address it, if you'll have us." What followed was not the confrontation Diane had feared, but something closer to a quiet unraveling of every assumption that had brought the caseworker to her door. Marcus laid out documentation of the club's charitable activities, the veterans' fund drives, the toy donations, letters from 3 different families the club had helped over the years. He explained, without defensiveness, that Grace had been welcomed exactly the way any new member of their extended community was welcomed, as an equal, with her opinions and preferences respected, never overridden. Ryan spoke last, and more plainly than Marcus had. "I know what it looks like," he said to Ms. Ortiz. "Big guy, tattoos, a leather vest with a wolf on it. I know the story people tell themselves before they ever talk to me. I've lived with that story my whole adult life. What I'd ask is that you don't let that story decide what happened here. Ask Grace what happened here. Ask her what she wants. She's 20 years old. She knows her own mind better than most people I've met, myself included." The other members of the club stood quietly behind Marcus and Ryan, offering no interruption, simply present, a wall of leather and steady patience that seemed to say more than any of them could have with words alone. One of them, a younger rider named Tommy, had brought his own daughter's old wheelchair ramp blueprints, having built one for his sister years back, and offered them to Ms. Ortiz's colleague as evidence of the kind of people the club actually was, folks who built things and fixed things and showed up when it mattered, not the caricature the anonymous complaint had painted. Miss Ortiz looked between the 2 of them, at Grace sitting quietly beside her mother, at the sugar cookies still cooling on the counter from the interrupted baking 2 nights before, and something in her posture softened. "I have to follow up on every complaint," she said. "That's the job. But I can tell you, having sat here today, that what I'm seeing is a young woman who is well cared for, who has clear opinions about her own life, and friends who respect those opinions. That's not what the complaint described." She looked at Diane. "I'll be closing this out. There's no cause for further action. I'm sorry you had to go through this at all." After Ms. Ortiz left, The porch was quiet for a moment before Grace, still processing everything that had happened, turned to Ryan with an expression somewhere between exhaustion and fierce relief. "You didn't have to bring everybody," she said, "but I'm glad you did." "That's what family does," Marcus said before Ryan could answer. "You're one of ours now, Grace. Been one of ours since the day you picked the blue bike." Grace laughed, wet-eyed, and hugged Marcus, then Ryan, then each of the other three men in turn, and Diane stood on her own porch watching her daughter surrounded by people the world had told her to fear, feeling something loosen in her chest that had been tight for 20 years. But the person responsible for the anonymous complaint had not yet been identified, and that unfinished thread would surface one more time before the story found its true resolution. It took less than a week for the truth to come out. Sarah Bennett, still troubled by the shift in Patricia Fields' demeanor after the caseworker's visit became known around the store, finally asked her directly whether she'd been the one to file the complaint. Patricia, cornered and defensive, admitted that she had called the county's family services line after her conversation with Diane, framing it, she insisted, as just checking, out of concern. Sarah did not shout. She simply looked at her co-worker for a long moment and said, "Grace has more people who love her and see her clearly than you will ever understand. You didn't check on her out of concern. You tried to take something away from her because it made you uncomfortable. There's a difference, and I think you know it." Patricia tried to protest, insisting she had only been following proper procedure, that anyone in her position would have done the same, but Sarah cut her off, unwilling to let the excuse stand unchallenged. "Anyone in your position who actually knew Grace would have asked her first, not gone behind her back to a stranger with a clipboard. You didn't know her at all, and you still decided you understood her life better than she did." She reported the incident to the store's regional manager that same afternoon, not out of vindictiveness, but because she believed firmly that Grace deserved a workplace that would not let this happen again. Patricia was reassigned to a different location within the month, and the new assistant manager who replaced her made a point, on her first day, of asking Grace how she'd like to organize the donated books, and then leaving them exactly that way. Diane told Grace the truth eventually, when Grace asked directly who had called the caseworker, because Grace had learned, over the years, that the truth was almost always better than being protected from it. Grace absorbed the news quietly, sitting on the porch steps beside Ryan, who had come by that Tuesday as he always did. "She thought I couldn't decide things for myself," Grace said finally. "That's why she did it." "That's exactly why," Ryan agreed. "And she was wrong. You've decided more things for yourself than most people I know ever have to. You decided to wave at a stranger on a bench. You decided he was worth trusting. You decided to keep being his friend even when people told you not to. Those aren't small decisions. Those took courage." Grace considered this, turning it over the way she turned over most important things, slowly and thoroughly. "I think," she said finally, "that people are scared of things they don't understand. Patricia didn't understand me. Kevin didn't understand you. Maybe if they'd just asked, instead of deciding, they wouldn't have been so scared." "Maybe," Ryan said. "Some people ask, some people never will, no matter how much proof you put in front of them. The trick is learning not to let the second kind decide who you let close to you." Christmas came 2 weeks later, and the Callahan house was fuller than it had been in years. Diane had invited Ryan, and Ryan had, without quite asking permission, invited Marcus and the 3 other wolves who had stood on the porch with him, along with their families. The small blue house on Birch Street filled with the smell of Diane's cooking and the sound of too many people trying to talk over a football game nobody was really watching. And Grace moved through the middle of it all, refilling drinks, showing off the new leather journal Ryan had given her, glowing in a way that made Diane's throat tighten every time she looked at her daughter. Kevin Sanders watched the cars and motorcycles fill the street from his window that evening, and whatever he thought, he kept to himself, though he did not bring up the Iron Wolves again at the next neighborhood association meeting. A month later, when his own truck broke down in his driveway and no one else on Birch Street offered to help, it was Ryan who walked over unasked, toolbox in hand, and spent 2 hours under the hood without once mentioning the caseworker or the complaint or anything Kevin had said about him. Kevin never became a friend to the club, but he stopped crossing the street when he saw Ryan's motorcycle parked outside the Callahan house, and sometimes, on Tuesday mornings, he even lifted a hand in something close to a wave. Diane, for her part, found that her fear had not vanished so much as changed shape. She still worried, the way any mother worries, but the worry no longer lived alone in her chest. She had watched her daughter be doubted, reported, and questioned by people who had never once bothered to ask Grace what she wanted, and she had watched Grace answer for herself anyway, clearly and without apology. That, more than anything, was what stayed with Diane through the winter. The memory of her daughter sitting at the kitchen table across from a stranger with a clipboard saying, "I can answer for myself," and meaning it completely. In January, the club officially made Grace's honorary vest permanent, stitching her full name beneath the patch at a small ceremony held at the garage where Ryan worked, surrounded by 24 people who had all, in one way or another, learned to see past the leather and the noise to the loyalty underneath. Grace stood at the center of it, hands folded, cheeks flushed with pride, and when Marcus asked if she wanted to say anything, she thought for a long moment before speaking. "I used to think nobody wanted to be my friend because of how I am," she said. "I thought that was just how it would always be. Then I waved at a man on a bench, and he waved back, and he kept coming back every week after that, even when people told him not to, even when people made it hard." She looked at Ryan, who stood at the edge of the small crowd, arms crossed, eyes suspiciously bright. "I just wanted a friend. I got a whole family instead." The garage erupted into applause, and Ryan crossed the room to hug her, the leather of his vest creaking against the leather of hers, 20 years and 34 collapsing into something that had never needed an explanation, only a chance. Diane watched from the doorway, thinking of all the fear she had carried for years about what would happen to her daughter in a world that too often decided, before ever asking, what Grace was and was not capable of. She thought of Patricia Fields and Kevin Sanders and every well-meaning stranger who had looked at her daughter and seen only a diagnosis. And she thought of Ryan Whitfield, who had looked at Grace on a bench outside a diner and seen simply a person worth waving back at. The Iron Wolves rode out of the garage lot that evening in loose formation, engines rumbling low against the cold January air, and Grace stood on the sidewalk beside her mother, watching them go, already looking forward to the following Tuesday, when Ryan would be back on the bench, waiting, exactly as he'd promised he would be. She had wanted all those months ago only a single friend. What she had found, in the end, was that one honest connection, freely given and freely returned, was enough to build an entire family around, one Tuesday at a time.